Hello, everyone. Have you ever thought that a 10-year-old boy could bring down a billionaire's empire with nothing more than a smile and a few messy drawings? Brace yourself, because this story will take you from cold corporate boardrooms to a warm treehouse, where a clumsy father learns to love life again, and trust me, you won't want to miss the moment he gets exposed in front of his entire company. Sit back, relax, and join me in exploring this chaotic yet wonderful journey. Don't forget to leave a like if you laugh as hard as I did. Jacob Elijah Hall, a billionaire with eyes as sharp as blades and a heart as cold as stone, trudged into his dimly lit office on a late February night in 2025. His expensive Italian silk tie, something he barely tolerated during suffocating gala nights, was now loosened, hanging like a white flag surrendering to exhaustion. The evening's banquet, as always, had been an endless performance, fake smiles glittering like cheap crystal, handshakes slick as engine oil, and hollow congratulations from people waiting for the perfect moment to dig into his deep pockets. Jacob was used to the game, the price one paid for the throne of power and wealth. But now, as the city lights flickered beyond the massive glass windows, he wanted only one thing: to retreat into his den, savoring a rare moment of solitude as a precious antidote before returning to his cold, lifeless mansion. But, dear heavens, what was waiting for him here? On the sleek leather couch, a luxury piece he once boasted to his business partners was worth more than their annual salaries, a small figure was curled up like a lost kitten. A baggy gray hoodie swallowed up the tiny body, making it look as though the fabric had consumed him whole. The boy was fast asleep, his soft breathing the only sound breaking the eerie silence, like a misplaced melody in Jacob's rigid tango of life. For a moment, he stood frozen, his feet seemingly nailed to the polished wooden floor. Did I drink too much champagne at the party, he wondered, rubbing his temples. Or was he finally hallucinating after working himself to exhaustion? How could a child have slipped past layers of fortress-like security, bypassed towering bodyguards with earpieces buzzing like a swarm of bees, and made it all the way to the top floor of his patents and enterprises empire? Jacob took a cautious step forward, his razor-sharp gaze, the same one that saw through every boardroom scheme, scanning the boy like a high-tech scanner. He couldn't be older than 8, with a mess of brown hair sticking up as if some mischievous wind had played with it. Tiny, pale fingers clutched a crumpled photograph, holding it close to his chest like a sacred relic. Jacob frowned. His first instinct was to pick up the phone, summon security, and throw this tiny intruder out of his domain. His life was a well-oiled machine, perfectly structured like numbers in a balance sheet. There was no room for chaos, let alone a stray child. But then, something made him pause. A strange feeling, like a cold draft slipping through a forgotten window, snaked into his chest. The boy's face, its delicate features, the slight furrow of his brow even in sleep, looked unsettlingly familiar, sending an unexpected tremor through Jacob's heart. It was like staring into an old, dusty mirror reflecting a younger, more vulnerable version of himself. Ridiculous, he scolded himself, taking a deep breath to shake off the absurd thought. Regardless of who the boy resembled, the real question was, how had he managed to get here, inside this supposedly impenetrable fortress? Before Jacob could act, the boy stirred. His small hands tightened around the photograph as if afraid someone would snatch it away. His eyes fluttered open, at first, dazed and unfocused, like mist rolling over a quiet lake, before suddenly locking onto Jacob. Without hesitation, he sat up, his already messy hair now even wilder, and asked in a clear, unwavering voice. "Are you my dad?" Time seemed to stop. Jacob, a man who could make an entire boardroom tremble with a single glance, was now frozen like a statue. For the first time in decades, he was speechless, his mouth slightly open, but no words came out. He blinked, convinced he had misheard, but the boy only rubbed his sleepy eyes with tiny fists, yawned loudly as if waking from a long dream, and repeated. "Are you my dad?" His voice was steady, confident, as if he were asking the most natural question in the world, like, "Is it going to rain today?" Jacob's stomach twisted as if an invisible hand had clenched around it. His razor-sharp mind, the very thing that had propelled him to the peak of power, screamed that this was impossible. No. He had no children. If he did, he would know. He was Jacob Elijah Hall, a man who controlled everything, from multi-million-dollar contracts to the placement of every pen on his desk. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice colder than he intended, slicing through the air like a knife. The boy hesitated, glancing down at the photo in his hands before looking back up. "I'm Matthew," he said, his voice soft but clear. "My mom told me that if I ever got lost, I should find you." A chill ran down Jacob's spine, like a window had been thrown open in the dead of winter. This was no ordinary lost child wandering into his office. This was deliberate. His gaze flickered to the photograph, still partially hidden beneath Matthew's small fingers. He reached out, gently but firmly, and took it. The old picture was worn, its edges frayed like the pages of a well-thumbed diary. But when he finally saw it clearly, his breath caught in his chest. It was him, Jacob, from over a decade ago, standing beside Olivia. Olivia. The woman he had buried deep in the shadows of his memory. The woman who had left without a single word. Her smile in the photo was as radiant as a spring sunrise, her eyes twinkling like stray stars. He had spent years trying not to think about her, to erase the moments of vulnerability she had once planted in his heart. And yet, here she was, smiling at him from the past, beside a younger, more hopeful Jacob, the man he had lost long ago. "Where is your mother?" he asked, his voice quieter, more unsteady than he wanted to admit. Matthew lowered his gaze, his tiny hands gripping the hem of his oversized hoodie. His small feet swung off the edge of the couch. "She's gone," he said after a long pause, his voice as fragile as dry leaves rustling in the wind. "She's gone." Those two words echoed in Jacob's head like church bells, loud and inescapable. Before he could ask anything else, the office door burst open. Two security guards stormed in, their earpieces buzzing, their eyes scanning the room like hawks on a hunt. "Sir, we've located the," one began, but Matthew immediately shrank back, pressing himself against Jacob as if seeking shelter. It was a small, almost instinctive movement, but Jacob noticed. He raised a hand, stopping the guards in their tracks. "It's fine," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "I'll handle it." The guards exchanged bewildered glances. They were probably wondering why their ruthless boss, the man who had once fired an entire department over a minor mistake, was now shielding a tiny intruder. But Jacob didn't care. His empire had been built on control and predictability. But tonight, for the first time, he let himself follow a different current, one named Matthew, carrying with it the echoes of Olivia and questions he had never dared to face. And as the office lights shimmered over the boy's tousled hair, Jacob knew, whether he liked it or not, that his life had just veered onto an entirely new path, one where the heart, not the mind, would lead the way. After a brief hesitation, as if trying to digest the bizarre situation that had just landed on their boss, the two burly bodyguards stiffly nodded and stepped back, their polished leather shoes creaking against the wooden floor. The door slammed shut behind them, echoing like the hammer of fate, leaving Jacob Elijah Hall alone with the strange boy named Matthew. He turned back, his sharp gaze now tinged with curiosity, meeting Matthew's clear eyes, eyes that were both cautious like a lost fawn and shimmering with hope like stars in the dark. The boy sat there, small in the massive leather chair, looking at him as if awaiting a life-altering verdict. Was this place a sanctuary for him, or merely a temporary stop before being cast out? Jacob didn't know what to do with the storm of emotions surging within him. His mind, a cold analytical machine that had propelled him to the pinnacle of power, now spun chaotically. Matthew couldn't be his son, how could he be? He would know. He had to know. Yet the name Olivia, like an old dagger, pierced through the armor he had so meticulously built. Olivia, the woman who had once been the radiant light in his darkest days, the one who vanished without a trace, leaving him with a loneliness so cold he had learned to call it normal. And now, this boy, clutching a crumpled photograph, was dragging him back to a past he had thought buried beneath the weight of his success. He should be angry. He should feel violated by this audacious intrusion. But instead, something stirred in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation, like the echo of an old melody he once loved. It felt disturbingly like responsibility, a word he had always deemed a burden for the weak. He exhaled heavily, rubbing his weary face, now lined with a few more wrinkles from sleepless nights. "All right, kid," he murmured, his voice raspy like the wind slipping through a cracked door. "Let's find some answers." That night, Jacob barely slept. He had placed Matthew in one of the luxurious guest rooms in his penthouse, a space so extravagant that even VIP guests marveled at its opulence. But as he lay on his king-sized bed, enveloped by cool silk sheets, he couldn't stop hearing the echo of that question. "Are you my father?" It drilled into his mind like a relentless bore, pulling up images of the old photograph, him and Olivia, their smiles bright as spring sunshine, their eyes gleaming as if untouched by sorrow. His instincts told him there was a greater secret buried beneath it all, a secret Olivia had taken with her when she disappeared. And now, all she had left behind was this boy, a misplaced puzzle piece from nowhere, declaring that he was looking for him. At the break of dawn, Jacob staggered into his office earlier than usual, clutching a cup of jet-black coffee, the only thing keeping him upright after a night wrestling with ghosts of the past. But the sight before him made him freeze, nearly dropping the cup. Matthew, completely awake, was sitting in his expensive leather office chair, his short legs swinging like tiny pendulums, spinning the chair slowly, like a miniature king on his throne. His meticulously minimalist workspace, a place of cold, ruthless efficiency, now looked as though a tiny tornado had swept through. On his polished ebony desk, chocolate wrappers lay scattered like petals after a storm, an empty coffee cup rolled on its side, and, dear God, his limited edition Mont Blanc pen was now dry, its ink splattered like a failed abstract painting. Jacob narrowed his eyes, inhaling deeply to suppress the impending explosion. "What exactly are you doing?" he growled, setting his coffee down with a sharp clack. Matthew paused mid-spin, looking up with a wide, cheeky grin, as carefree as a sparrow that had just found a grain of rice. "Just making myself comfortable," he said, popping another piece of chocolate into his mouth, chewing noisily. "You had some fancy chocolates in your drawer, so I figured you wouldn't mind sharing." Jacob pinched the bridge of his nose, struggling for composure. "Those chocolates were imported from Belgium," he said, his voice quivering with barely contained rage. "They cost more than those ragged sneakers on your feet." Matthew shrugged, unimpressed. "Sounds fancy, but at the end of the day, it's still just chocolate." He said it so nonchalantly, like a tiny philosopher delivering an undeniable truth. Before Jacob could retort, the office door burst open. Natalie, his ever-efficient assistant, strode in, her heels clicking against the floor like an urgent drumbeat. With her tightly coiled bun and razor-sharp gaze, she was the embodiment of competence, someone who had been by his side long enough to recognize when something very unusual was happening. And this was beyond unusual. "What the hell is going on here?" she demanded, her voice crisp as steel, eyes darting between Jacob and the tiny intruder making himself at home in his chair. Matthew leaned back, waving at her with the confidence of an honored guest. "Hey, I'm Matthew," he greeted, utterly unfazed. Natalie crossed her arms, clearly unmoved by his charm. She turned to Jacob, arching a brow that screamed, "Explain. Now." Jacob exhaled, running a hand down his face like he could physically wipe away the headache brewing. "It's complicated," he admitted, glancing at Matthew, then back at Natalie. "The kid says his mother told him to find me." His mother. He hesitated, feeling the weight of the name settle in his chest. "Is Olivia?" Natalie's eyebrows shot up, her eyes widening in shock. Olivia, that name was no stranger to her. She had been by Jacob's side long enough to witness how her departure had changed him, even though he always pretended it hadn't. She turned to Matthew, her sharp gaze softening slightly as she took in the small boy sitting before her. "So, what exactly are you doing here, kid?" she asked, her tone gentler now but still laced with skepticism. Matthew swung his legs beneath the desk, answering with a simple honesty that somehow cracked through the tension in the room. "Like I said," he nodded toward Jacob, "Mom told me that if I ever got lost, I should find Jacob. She talked about him a lot." He hesitated, tugging at the frayed sleeve of his hoodie before adding, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "She said he used to be important. That he was someone she cared about." Jacob's chest tightened, as if an invisible hand had just clenched around his heart. For years, he had convinced himself that Olivia left without a second thought, that she never looked back. But now, this boy, her son, sat before him, telling him that he had been a part of her story. "What did she say about me?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Matthew shrugged, his clear eyes catching the morning light. "Just that you mattered," he said simply. "She never told me why you weren't around." Jacob felt his stomach twist. He flicked his gaze to Natalie, wordlessly signaling what he needed. She understood immediately, Natalie always did. She nodded, pulling out her phone as she stepped out of the room, leaving Jacob alone with the biggest question of his life. Was Matthew the key to the truth he had long buried? Or was he just another fleeting ghost, disturbing the carefully constructed walls Jacob had built to keep the past from ever touching him again? Jacob took a deep breath, slow and deliberate, as if trying to reclaim the calm that had been stolen from him over the past few days. His eyes were locked onto Matthew, the boy sitting there with an infuriating innocence, as if the whole world were just one big playground for him to run wild in. A dozen questions danced through Jacob's mind, but patience, already paper-thin in his life, had now completely vanished. He opened his mouth to ask more, but before he could utter a word, Matthew's gaze shifted to something else, Jacob's sleek laptop, sitting proudly on the desk, its bright screen glowing like an open invitation. "Oh wow!" Matthew exclaimed, his eyes sparkling as if he had just discovered a pirate's treasure. "Is this your computer? It looks expensive." Jacob frowned, his voice cracking like thunder. "Don't touch it." But it was too late. Matthew's tiny fingers, quick and mischievous like a squirrel's, had already danced across the keyboard with unstoppable curiosity. Jacob lunged forward, reaching for the laptop like a hero trying to save the world from catastrophe, but at that very moment, Matthew pressed a key, firmly. "Oh," the boy murmured, tilting his head as if studying a strange painting. Jacob glanced at the screen, and his stomach plummeted. An email had just been sent, not to one person, but to all his investors. Matthew looked up, flashing an awkward smile like a puppy that had just knocked over a priceless vase. That wasn't supposed to happen, was it?" Jacob clenched his jaw, gripping the laptop as if he might crush it in frustration. He skimmed the email's content, and his heart, hardened by years of battles, briefly stopped. Subject: extremely important business matters. The content? A ridiculous string of emojis, some pizza slices, a floating spaceship, and, heaven help him, a big thumbs up, as if cheering on a neighborhood soccer match. Jacob closed his eyes, inhaling so deeply it seemed even the air protested. "I can explain," Matthew mumbled, his voice racing ahead of the impending storm. Jacob exhaled through his nose, the sound a low, rumbling growl. "I highly doubt that, kid." Just then, Natalie burst into the room, her phone vibrating in her hand like an angry wasp. But she froze at the doorway, her high heels halting as she took in the tension so thick it could be sliced with a knife. She glanced at Jacob, his face now a deep shade of red, ready to erupt, then at Matthew, and finally let out a long, exhausted sigh, the kind a weary mother makes when discovering her child has once again wreaked havoc. "What did he do?" she asked, her voice calm, but her eyes sharp enough to drill through any deception. Jacob silently turned the laptop toward her. Natalie squinted at the screen, then, much to Jacob's horror, burst into laughter. Not a polite chuckle, but a full-bodied, shoulder-shaking laugh that made Jacob glare as if he could incinerate her on the spot. "This isn't funny," he growled. "Oh no, it is," she gasped between fits of laughter. "Half your investors are probably having heart attacks over those little smiley faces." Matthew, at least aware enough to feel embarrassed, muttered, "I was just trying to close the window." "You really shouldn't leave important stuff open like that." Jacob spun toward him, staring in disbelief. "Are you seriously lecturing me about security right now?" Matthew shrugged, his expression as nonchalant as a street philosopher. "Just saying. Big risk." Natalie, still grinning, tapped away at her phone. "Honestly, Jacob, some of those investors could probably use a little humor to spice up their dull lives." Jacob pinched the bridge of his nose, feeling as if the entire universe were conspiring against him. "This kid is going to kill me," he muttered, sounding like a defeated soldier. Matthew looked up, flashing a grin so wide it seemed to brighten the whole room. "So, you're not kicking me out, right?" Jacob hesitated. He knew he should throw this kid out of his office, out of his life, and return to the cold, orderly existence he was used to. But there was something in Matthew's eyes, in the way he clutched that old photograph, in how he mentioned Olivia, that made Jacob's heart, frozen for years, stir just a little. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, "Not yet, kid." Matthew pumped his fist into the air. "Awesome. Oh God, what am I doing?" Jacob wondered aloud, his voice lost in the air. That morning, he spent hours cleaning up the mess Matthew had created with his absurd email attack. He sent out apology letters, blaming the incident on a technical glitch, a blatant lie he hoped would salvage his reputation. But truthfully, his mind wasn't in it. Matthew's presence, that old photograph, and Olivia's name lingered like a draft through a forgotten door, stirring up memories he had long buried. He had tried not to think of her, convinced himself she was just a past best left untouched. But now, she was back, not in person, but in the form of this mischievous boy with chocolate crumbs in his pockets and an innocence that both annoyed and unsettled him. By noon, Natalie returned, shutting the office door with a quiet yet foreboding click. Jacob looked up, and one glance at her hesitant eyes, so uncharacteristically uncertain, told him he was about to hear something terrible. Matthew, oblivious to the tension, was flipping through an old financial magazine, frowning at stock charts as if they had personally insulted him. "These lines look like kindergarten scribbles," he muttered, nearly making Jacob laugh if he weren't so tense. Natalie took a deep breath, her voice softer than usual. "I looked into Olivia." She stole a quick glance at Matthew before turning back to Jacob, as if debating whether to say this in front of the boy. Jacob sat up straight, his hands gripping the desk. "Go on." Natalie nodded, her voice lowering to a grave tone. "She passed away last year. Cancer, from what I found." She kept to herself, no big records, no press, just, slipped away quietly. Jacob's chest tightened, as if an invisible hand had clenched around his ribs. Olivia was gone. Gone from this world, gone from him, forever. The news didn't feel real, like it belonged to another story, another life. But no, this was his past, the past he had buried under layers of ice-cold success. He had told himself she left without a second thought, that he no longer mattered to her. But now, faced with the bitter truth, he realized he would never have the chance to ask her, why. And Matthew, this grinning, troublesome boy with an old photograph and an endless supply of questions, was the last piece of Olivia's story, both a gift and a heartache Jacob could no longer ignore. Matthew, who had been as silent as a small bird nestled in its nest throughout Natalie's explanation, suddenly spoke, breaking the heavy atmosphere. His voice was gentle, but his small hands clutched the edge of an old magazine on the table, trembling slightly as if trying to hold on to something fragile. "I know my mom was sick," he said, his eyes fixed on the floor, as if unable to meet Jacob's gaze. She didn't talk about it much. She just said she wanted me to be okay. Then, as if compelled by a distant memory, he reached into the front pocket of his faded hoodie and pulled out a tiny silver pendant, its surface glinting faintly under the office light. His fingers tightened around it, knuckles whitening from the pressure, as though it was the last thread connecting him to his late mother. Jacob swallowed dryly, his throat parched like a desert. "Did your mother ever mention me?" he asked, his voice hoarse, almost afraid to hear the answer. Matthew nodded but still didn't look up, his gaze fixed on the pendant. "She said you were special," he murmured. His thumb brushed over the silver surface, a subconscious gesture that seemed practiced, as if he had done it 1,000 times to comfort himself. "She didn't say much, just that you used to be very important." Those words, simple yet sharp as a blade, pierced straight into Jacob's chest. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting, landing on the boy, a small intruder who had walked into his life less than 24 hours ago and shaken him more than any billion-dollar deal or crisis ever had. Olivia had hidden him. If she knew about Matthew, if she deliberately kept this secret, then why? The questions swirled in his mind like a storm, sweeping away the logic he had painstakingly built. He needed air, an escape from the emotional whirlwind tightening around him. "Let's go," he said abruptly, standing up. His voice was gruff, but it couldn't conceal his unease. "We're going to lunch." Matthew's eyes immediately lit up, like a puppy perking up at the sound of a food bag opening. "Oh, so now you're actually going to feed me?" Jacob shot him a dry look. "You already helped yourself to half of my expensive chocolate this morning, kid. Consider that your appetizer." Standing nearby, Natalie smirked, nudging Jacob's arm as he grabbed his coat. "You know, you're actually not bad at this, Dad, thing," she teased, her tone both warm and playful. Jacob glared at her, ice cold. "Don't push it." The sleek black company car, its tinted windows exuding power, glided through the bustling streets. Matthew pressed his nose against the window the entire ride, his wide eyes absorbing the city like an astronaut stepping onto an alien planet for the first time. When they pulled up in front of an upscale restaurant, one of Jacob's usual spots for entertaining high-profile clients with extravagant meals, Matthew groaned before even stepping out of the car. "Ugh," he grumbled, sounding as exasperated as an old man forced to attend a tedious party. "This place looks way too fancy." Jacob arched a brow, tilting his head slightly. "That's because it is, kid." Matthew clutched his head dramatically, groaning again. "Do they have normal food?" Jacob sighed, rubbing his temple as if trying to ward off an impending headache. "Define normal." Matthew crossed his arms, adopting a serious expression like a tiny food critic. "Burgers, fries, milkshakes, real food." Jacob considered this. For over a decade, he had been accustomed to elaborate meals served on pristine white plates, dishes with names too long to bother pronouncing, and glasses of wine that cost more than a family's rent. A casual diner? He hadn't stepped into one since his days of wearing torn t-shirts and dreaming big. But the way Matthew scrunched his nose at the lavish restaurant, looking at it as if it were a monster, softened something in Jacob in a way he didn't quite understand. "Fine," he muttered, reluctantly but with a flicker of warmth in his eyes. "You pick the place." And that was how they ended up at a rundown little diner, complete with faded red vinyl booths and laminated menus stained with grease, probably dating back to Jacob's grandfather's time. Matthew practically bounced in his seat, his eyes lighting up as he ordered a greasy cheeseburger, a mountain of golden fries, and a towering chocolate milkshake. Jacob, in his tailored suit, stuck out like a sore thumb among the patrons in jeans and hoodies. He ordered a black coffee in a burger, feeling oddly like an outsider in a world he had long left behind. But Matthew? He fit right in, as comfortable as if he were home. "See," he said, his mouth full of fries. "This is real food." Jacob took a sip of coffee, watching the boy with a mix of curiosity and something else, something unfamiliar yet strangely grounding. I take it your mom used to bring you to places like this? Matthew nodded, his grin stretching wide enough to light up the dim diner. Yeah, she said fancy places make people forget what good food really tastes like. She would have hated that restaurant you tried to drag me into. Jacob chuckled softly, a rare sound that even startled him. I think I'm starting to like her taste. But then he stopped, staring down at his coffee, the question he had been avoiding since last night clawing its way to the surface. Matthew, he said carefully, did your mom ever say why she never told me about you? Matthew chewed slower, the burger in his hand suddenly feeling heavier. He swallowed, looking smaller in the worn-out vinyl booth. Not really, he admitted, his voice lowering like leaves drifting to the ground. She just said things weren't right. That you had a different life. Jacob clenched his jaw, frustration and a deep, aching sadness rising in his chest. That wasn't the answer he wanted. It wasn't enough to soothe the wound tearing through him. Matthew stirred his straw in his milkshake absently, then suddenly looked up, his expression more serious than a 10-year-old should ever be. Did you love my mom? The question hit Jacob like a bullet to the heart, tightening his throat. He wasn't prepared for this, not in a rundown diner, not with this boy staring at him with eyes too clear, too knowing. Olivia's face flashed in his mind, vivid as if she were standing before him, her laughter ringing like wind chimes, the way she'd glare at him only to break into a smile moments later, the way she would rest her head on his shoulder when she was tired, as if he were her entire world. He had loved her. Loved her deeply in a way he had never admitted to anyone, not even himself. And maybe, deep in the frozen parts of his heart, he had never stopped. But how could he explain that to a child? Jacob cleared his throat, gripping his coffee cup as if it could anchor him. Your mother was very special to me, he said evenly, keeping his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Matthew studied him, as if searching for the truth beneath his words. Then he simply nodded and, without ceremony, swiped another handful of fries from Jacob's plate. Yeah, he murmured, voice quiet but certain. I think she thought you were special, too. Jacob didn't respond. He just sat there, letting Matthew's words settle into the spaces Olivia had left behind, like a warm breeze in the coldest winter. Olivia was gone, taking with her the answers he would never have. But Matthew was here, with his mischievous grin and wide-open heart, a final gift from the woman he had once loved. A chance, perhaps, to reclaim something he thought he had lost forever. Love. Even if it had come late. Jacob couldn't comprehend why Matthew's simple words felt like an undertow, pulling him into a whirlpool of uncontrollable emotions. Throughout the entire drive from the rundown diner back to the penthouse, he remained nearly silent, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only anchor keeping him from being swept away by the chaos of his thoughts. He didn't know what to say, words that were usually sharp as knives now felt clumsy, lost in his throat. Matthew, the boy who was usually as chatty as a chirping bird, was also unusually quiet. He sat there, his clear eyes fixed on the window, clutching his half-finished chocolate milkshake like a precious treasure, as if it were the last thread connecting him to the peaceful days of the past. Matthew's question, did you love my mother? Still echoed in Jacob's mind like a church bell ringing in an empty cathedral. It had caught him off guard, like a stone shattering the glass of the carefully constructed calm he had built. And his own response, your mother was very special to me, was both true and lacking, like an old coat that no longer fit. He had loved Olivia once, loved her with a passion so fierce and consuming that he had believed no one else could ever replace her in his heart. But that love, though it burned bright like a flame, wasn't strong enough to keep them together. Now, she was gone forever, leaving behind a boy with the same defiant eyes as hers and a mountain of questions Jacob had no idea how to answer. He pulled himself out of his thoughts as the car rolled to a stop in front of the towering building, the luxurious penthouse, absurdly expensive, but never truly home. It was the result of years of relentless ambition, a proud monument to his success. But looking at it now, all Jacob saw was an empty space, a place where a child like Matthew didn't seem to belong. But Matthew didn't dwell on such deep thoughts. As soon as he stepped inside, he let out a soft whistle, his bright eyes scanning the high ceiling that stretched like the sky and the sleek, modern furniture that looked straight out of an architecture magazine. "Wow," he murmured, spinning around slowly, before declaring with awe, "This is so boring." Jacob blinked, stunned as if he had just been doused with cold water. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice dry. Matthew pointed at the pristine white walls, the minimalist decor, and the expensive abstract painting that Jacob had never really paid attention to. "This looks like a rich guy's cave, no color, no personality. Do you actually live here?" Jacob sighed, setting his keys down on the cold marble kitchen counter. "I work, I sleep. That's it," he replied, his tone as flat as a financial report. Matthew scrunched his nose in exaggerated disappointment, looking like an old man forced to watch a children's movie. "That sounds ridiculously boring." Jacob ignored him, pulling out his phone with a sudden decision. "I'm going to request a DNA test," he muttered, half to himself, half to Matthew. "We need to be sure." Matthew shrugged, completely unfazed, his grin never fading. "Sure, but I already know." Jacob glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "Know what?" Matthew patted his own cheek and burst into laughter. "We've got the same grumpy face. I saw it in the mirror this morning." Jacob ran a hand over his face, muttering internally, "This kid is going to drive me insane." The DNA test was scheduled, and over the next few days, Jacob found himself unwillingly falling into a strange routine with Matthew. At first, he had intended to set strict rules: no touching his things, no making a mess, no disrupting his meticulously ordered life. But he quickly realized that such rules were as useless as throwing stones into the ocean. Matthew never sat still. He explored the penthouse like an adventurer discovering an alien planet, poking at everything from the expensive wall clock to the shelves lined with dry, unread economic books that Jacob had never made it past the second page. He even horrified Jacob by rummaging through the fridge, a place stocked only with luxury items delivered by high-end grocery services. "You only eat weird, expensive stuff?" Matthew asked, holding up a container of organic hummus as if it were evidence of a crime. Jacob sighed, rubbing his temples. "I eat normal food." Matthew tilted his head, eyeing him suspiciously before bursting into laughter. "Normal where? Have you ever had fries or a burger?" Jacob opened his mouth to answer but then closed it, realizing he couldn't name a single thing in his fridge that Matthew would consider normal. The boy just let out an exaggerated sigh and muttered, "That's tragic." But it wasn't Matthew's endless energy or his barrage of questions that unsettled Jacob the most. It was the drawings. The kid had a habit of doodling constantly, and for some reason, he always snuck into Jacob's office, leaving behind little sketches on his desk. Rough, lively drawings, self-portraits with his signature goofy grin, exaggerated cartoons of Jacob with his usual scowl, and sometimes both of them together, tiny, animated versions standing side by side, their grumpy expressions humorously magnified. Once, Jacob even found a drawing of the two of them sitting on the couch, one holding a milkshake, the other a coffee, like an odd yet familiar pair. And what made his chest tighten was the common theme in every drawing: they were always a family, no explanations, no doubts, just that simple, undeniable truth. Jacob didn't know what to do with the emotions these drawings stirred in him. He had spent years controlling everything, building an empire with ruthless logic and a frozen heart. But Matthew, with his carefree attitude and innocent sketches, was slowly breaking down that wall. He looked at the boy, now sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, pencil in hand, sketching yet another picture, and wondered, did Olivia send him here on purpose to change me? The penthouse, once just a place where he worked and slept, was no longer the same. It was coming to life in the most chaotic, unexpected way, all because of a boy with his mother's eyes and a heart unafraid to open. And Jacob, though he didn't want to admit it, knew he was starting to find something he thought he had lost forever, a sense of belonging. Late in the afternoon, after an exhausting, drawn-out meeting at the company, where numbers and strategies swirled like a storm, Jacob trudged back to his penthouse, his shoulders heavy with fatigue. As soon as he pushed open the door, he saw Matthew curled up on the sleek leather couch, eyes glued to the TV screen, where cartoon characters bounced around in a frenzy. Jacob intended to ignore him and head straight to his office to find some quiet amidst the stacks of paperwork, but Matthew, quick as lightning, looked up, scooted over, and patted the empty spot beside him. "Sit," he commanded, his voice unwavering, cutting through the noise of the show. Jacob raised an eyebrow, his expression as skeptical as an old man forced into something against his will. "No." Matthew was unfazed. He patted the couch again, harder this time, like a tiny but resolute general. "Sit down. You look like you need this." Jacob sighed, the sound as weary as the evening wind, knowing he was too drained to argue with this stubborn kid. He sat down stiffly, bracing himself for 20 minutes of meaningless noise. But then, something unexpected happened. The show was ridiculous, animated animals running amok, causing absurd chaos, but Matthew burst into laughter, a bright, unrestrained sound that echoed through the room, making him nearly fall off the couch. And despite all his efforts to remain serious, despite the cold, impenetrable wall he had built around himself, Jacob smiled. Then, as if caught in a wave, he laughed, a real, deep laugh, one he couldn't remember the last time he had let escape. Matthew tilted his head, grinning triumphantly. "See? I knew you had it in you." Jacob shook his head, muttering, "You're the most exhausting person I've ever met, kid." Matthew puffed out his chest proudly. "Thank you." Days passed, and though Jacob had initially been reluctant, like an old man forced into a child's game, he gradually found himself adjusting to Matthew's presence in ways no one could have predicted. He learned that the boy hated waking up early but was obsessed with pancakes, the golden stacks he started making every morning, even though he had only ever known black coffee and cold toast. Matthew had a habit of tapping his foot incessantly when he was lost in thought, like a strange little melody filling the silence. He talked too much during movies, commenting on everything from the plot to the characters' clothing, but somehow, it made the films 10 times more entertaining. Then, one late night, as Jacob walked into his office, his eyes heavy after a long day, he suddenly realized how much warmth Matthew had brought into his life, like a small flame flickering in the once cold space he had called home. On his desk lay a new drawing, heartbreakingly different from the usual ones. It wasn't just Jacob and Matthew this time, Olivia was there too, standing between them, holding both their hands, her smile as gentle as the full moon. Above them, in the wobbly handwriting of a child, Matthew had written, "Mom's family." Jacob stared at it for a long time, as if time itself had paused. The next morning, the DNA test results arrived, sealed in a pristine white envelope on his desk. He hesitated, his hands trembling before he opened it, as if some part of him already knew the truth without needing the confirmation. And indeed, from the moment Matthew had walked into his office, clutching an old photograph, Jacob had felt it. The paper confirmed it, Matthew was his son. Jacob set it down, his gaze drifting toward the kitchen counter, where Matthew sat happily devouring the pancakes he had made that morning, syrup smeared around his mouth. The boy looked like he had always belonged there, nestled in the lavish penthouse that had once been nothing more than a hollow shell. Jacob remained in his office, the test results lying there like a ticking time bomb, his eyes locked on them. He had read them 3 times, each word etching itself into his mind, "Matthew is your son." No doubt, no loophole, no way to convince himself this was just some bizarre misunderstanding. Olivia had kept this from him, hidden this part of his life, and now she was gone, leaving him with a child he had never known existed. His son, the phrase felt heavy, foreign, like a stone dropping into a still pond, sending ripples through everything he had once believed. He had never imagined himself as a father. Jacob Elijah Hall, the man who controlled entire industries with the flick of a pen, who closed million-dollar deals and shaped markets, had no idea how to build a life, let alone raise a child. What was he supposed to do with a 10-year-old who had eaten all his imported chocolate and critiqued his interior design choices like a professional reviewer? His life had always been about control, precision, and strategy. But fatherhood? That was an uncharted labyrinth, a storm he couldn't predict. Panic welled up inside him, cold and sharp like winter air slipping through a cracked window. His first instinct was to run, not to abandon Matthew, of course not, but there had to be a more logical way to handle this. A prestigious boarding school, perhaps, one that specialized in nurturing exceptional children. He could provide Matthew with everything: security, education, a bright future, without appending the carefully constructed life he had built. It made sense. He almost convinced himself it was the best option. Then Natalie stormed in, shattering his illusion like a wrecking ball. "Are you serious?" she demanded, arms crossed, her gaze sharp as a blade cutting through his defenses. Jacob exhaled slowly, not looking up from his desk. "It's what's best for him," he said, his voice as rigid as a quarterly report. Natalie scoffed, the sound dripping with disdain. "No. It's what's easiest for you." He froze. The words hit him like a slap, shaking him out of his selfish haze. His eyes drifted toward the kitchen, where Matthew was waving his hands animatedly, telling some story to his pancakes. And suddenly, he understood. Like it or not, the boy hadn't just entered his life. Matthew had become a part of it. Jacob's jaw tightened as if he were holding on to the last shred of composure before the storm of emotions hit. "I don't know how to be a father," he ground out, his voice sharp yet trembling. Natalie folded her arms, her tone cutting through his defenses like a blade. "You think throwing money at this problem will make it go away? You can send the boy to the best school in the world, Jacob, but that won't change the fact that he wants to be with you. He's already lost his mother. Do you really want to be the next person who makes him feel like a burden?" Her words struck like an arrow to the heart, making Jacob shudder. He hated how easily Natalie saw through him, hated that she was painfully right. His gaze wavered, but her voice softened, a gentle breeze against the storm. "I know you're scared, Jacob. But you can't buy your way out of this. He doesn't need your money, he needs you. If you push him away now, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." Jacob didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the DNA test results on the table, his mind spiraling in a storm of doubt and fear. That night, after Matthew had fallen asleep, Jacob stood silently in the boy's doorway. The child was curled up beneath a thick blanket, his small hands clutching a silver locket, his one remaining link to Olivia. His face was peaceful, trusting, like a fledgling tucked safely in its nest, and something in Jacob's chest ached at the sight. "What the hell am I doing?" he asked himself, his hands trembling. He had spent his entire life conquering power, success, heights others only dreamed of. But standing before this child, he had never felt more terrified. This wasn't a business deal, a strategy, or a contract he could control. This was a boy who had lost his mother, and Jacob could not, must not be the reason he lost someone else. With a weary sigh, he rubbed a hand over his face, then stepped into the room. He was no good at this. He had no eloquent words or perfect plan. But he had to start somewhere. "Hey, kid," he murmured, his voice rough like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Matthew stirred, blinking sleepily and rubbing his eyes. Jacob hesitated, then sat at the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping slightly under his weight. "You're staying here, with me," he said, his voice unsteady, as if afraid the promise might dissolve. Matthew blinked again, then sat up, his hair a tangled mess. "For how long?" Jacob's throat tightened. The silence stretched between them. Then, the boy grinned, a bright, unguarded smile that cut through the heavy air like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Forever." Jacob sighed, shaking his head. Don't push it, kid. Matthew flopped back onto his pillow, still laughing. I knew you wouldn't send me away. Jacob raised a brow, pretending to be stern. You sure about that? Matthew nodded confidently, his eyes sparkling. You like me. Just admit it. Jacob snorted but couldn't stop the corner of his mouth from twitching upward. That's debatable. Matthew just smirked, his eyelids growing heavy as sleep pulled him under once more. Jacob sat there for a long time, watching him, trying to accept that his life had just taken a turn he had never prepared for. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to go back to the way things were. The next morning, Matthew was a whirlwind of energy, munching on pancakes as he made an announcement over breakfast. Since I'm staying, I think we need to do something really important. Jacob, still half asleep, took a sip of his black coffee and eyed him warily. Do I want to know? Matthew nodded, as serious as a boardroom executive. We need to build a pillow fort. Jacob blinked. His coffee cup paused midair. A what? A pillow fort. Matthew repeated, as if it were an unquestionable universal truth. Every home needs one. It's essential. Jacob pinched the bridge of his nose. His brain was not equipped for this. I run a multi-billion-dollar company, kid. Matthew gave him a knowing look, eyes gleaming with mischief. And yet, you don't know how to build a fort. Jacob opened his mouth to argue, then promptly closed it. He had nothing. Natalie, passing through the kitchen with her coffee, overheard and let out a snort. Oh, you're doomed, Jacob. And that was how, 20 minutes later, Jacob Elijah Hall, powerful billionaire, feared in boardrooms worldwide, found himself sitting cross-legged on the floor of his penthouse, surrounded by expensive silk pillows, struggling to construct a fort under the merciless direction of a 10-year-old. No, not like that. Matthew huffed, hands on his hips like a disapproving foreman. There's no structure to it. Jacob shot him a deadpan look. Since when are you an engineer? Matthew puffed out his chest. Obviously, I am one. And this? This is terrible. Jacob shook his head, but despite himself, his lips twitched into a smile. They started over, Matthew barking orders like a battlefield general while Jacob, clumsy but determined, followed along. It was ridiculous. Absurd. But, somehow, he didn't mind. For the first time in years, the penthouse wasn't a cold, empty shell. It was alive. Warm. A mess of scattered pillows and laughter. Jacob had negotiated billion-dollar deals, crushed ruthless competitors, and outmaneuvered the sharpest minds in business. But nothing had prepared him for Matthew, the tiny hurricane with boundless energy and a stubbornness that rivaled even the most cutthroat CEOs. The first few days were pure survival. Matthew asked a million questions, never sat still, and transformed the apartment into his personal amusement park. Jacob, accustomed to order and silence, felt like he had been thrown into deep water with bricks tied to his feet. But he was Jacob Hall, he solved problems with precision and efficiency. If fatherhood was now a part of his life, then surely, there were experts to help. Within 48 hours, he assembled an elite team, nannies, child psychologists, education consultants, each carefully vetted, their credentials flawless, their experience impeccable. Matthew fired them all. The first was too serious. The second was too old, Matthew's words, not Jacob's. The third smelled weird. The fourth was a particularly memorable disaster. She lasted exactly 1 hour before Matthew locked her outside the apartment, wedged a chair under the doorknob, and announced to Jacob with perfect nonchalance, "Our family doesn't need a nanny." Jacob nearly lost his mind. Natalie, of course, found the whole thing hilarious. "You're a Fortune 500 CEO, and you lost a power struggle to a 10-year-old, she teased, sipping her coffee. Jacob glared at her, muttering, "He's insubordinate." But deep down, he knew she was right. Matthew didn't want a nanny. He didn't need a strict schedule or a team of experts. He just wanted Jacob. And that terrified him more than any corporate takeover ever had. It was a wake-up call, an alarm ringing in the cold fortress of his heart. Jacob Hall's life was no longer just his own. A sluggish morning, as Jacob trudged into the kitchen with bloodshot eyes from lack of sleep and a head as heavy as if he had just survived a war of paperwork, he caught sight of Matthew perched smugly on the counter, clutching his tablet with a suspiciously self-satisfied grin. Jacob groaned, running a hand through his hair, a tangled mess after a night of wrestling with financial reports. "Why do I have a terrible feeling that something awful just happened?" he mumbled, his voice hoarse like an old man forced out of bed too early. Matthew looked up, his grin beaming as brightly as the morning sun. "Because it already did." Jacob narrowed his eyes, his sharp gaze flicking from the boy to the tablet. He snatched it away, swiping at the screen, and immediately, his face turned to stone. Right there, in front of thousands of live viewers, was a broadcast of his own grumpy, sleep-deprived face, an ongoing virtual meeting with the company's investors, which, somehow, Matthew had managed to accidentally stream for the past 20 minutes. Jacob nearly choked. His inbox had exploded with emails from the board, half bewildered, half entertained, as if they had just witnessed the world's most unexpected comedy show. Natalie, of course, was no help, having sent only a single, gleeful message: "This is the best day of my life." Jacob turned to Matthew, his voice dangerously calm, like the sky before a storm. "Explain. Now." Matthew shrugged, as carefree as a bird that had landed on the wrong branch. "You left your laptop open." "I wanted to play Minecraft. That button looked important, so I pressed it." Jacob closed his eyes, inhaling deeply as if trying to swallow his fury. "You live-streamed me to the entire company?" Matthew tapped his chin, feigning deep thought. "Some guy was trying to ask a question, but I muted him." Jacob's mouth opened, then shut again. Silent. Defeated. Completely outmaneuvered by a 10-year-old. Natalie appeared shortly after, still giggling like she had just won the lottery. "You should retire, Jacob. The kid won." Jacob muttered something about rewriting his will to punish the world, then locked his devices behind layers of security thick enough to make NASA sweat. But deep down, he knew the truth: it was time to be fully present in Matthew's life, no outsourcing, no hiding. That realization came one afternoon when Matthew came home, waving a crumpled flyer like a prize trophy. "There's a big event at school this Friday," he announced, shoving the paper into Jacob's hands. Jacob glanced at it, an art exhibition. "Yeah, and you have to come," Matthew added, eyes gleaming with expectation. Jacob hesitated. He hadn't set foot in a school since his own uniform-wearing days. His life revolved around sleek boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations, not chaotic parent gatherings and colorful art shows. But Matthew was looking at him, eyes bright like a lighthouse in the dark, and this time, Jacob couldn't find an excuse. Friday evening, he showed up, feeling like a penguin in the desert. The room buzzed with parents, children, and teachers, all milling around homemade art displays. In his tailored suit, Jacob stood out like a wax statue in a sea of sweaters and jeans, fingers itching to check his phone every 5 seconds just for something familiar. Then Matthew dashed over, grinning like the summer sun. "Come on, you have to see my masterpiece." Jacob followed, bracing himself for a crude doodle, perhaps some illegible scribbles. But when Matthew pointed to his masterpiece, Jacob's breath caught. It was a drawing, clumsy, shaky, and so hilariously bad it was almost endearing, of him, a stick figure with deeply furrowed brows, carrying an oversized briefcase as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Beside him stood Matthew, another stick figure, but beaming with the brightness of a new day. Above them, in wobbly handwriting, Matthew had written, "Me and my dad." Jacob stared for a long time, his throat tightening. "Do you like it?" Matthew asked, eyes scanning his face for a reaction. Jacob cleared his throat, masking his emotions. It's something. Matthew's grin widened, triumphant. You like it? Jacob exhaled, shaking his head in defeat. It's going in a frame. The next day, that ridiculous stick figure drawing sat proudly on Jacob's desk, right in the center of his polished, high-powered office, where everyone could see it. Natalie walked by, halted mid-step, and stared as if he had lost his mind. Are you okay? Did you hit your head? Jacob took a sip of coffee and grunted, shut up. She smirked and strolled off, tossing one last remark over her shoulder, welcome to fatherhood, boss. Jacob sat there, for the first time, truly understanding what it meant to be a father, not perfect, far from perfect, but learning to embrace the chaos. Mornings were now filled with the smell of burnt toast, Matthew's experiments, and endless debates over everything from movies to the proper way to fold a blanket. Evenings were spent in pillow fortresses, where Matthew would critique films like a seasoned reviewer while Jacob, despite his initial grumbling, found himself strangely entertained. He liked how Matthew turned his cold, museum-like penthouse into a living, breathing home, with scribbled drawings scattered across his once pristine desk. He liked coming home to find his expensive suits dusted with cookie crumbs, though he would never admit it. And he liked how Matthew constantly challenged him, keeping him on edge like a veteran fighter in the ring. One afternoon, when Matthew roped him into repainting a section of the living room, resulting in both of them covered in paint and the wall looking like an explosion of colors, Jacob laughed, a deep, unrestrained sound echoing through the mess. You are my worst nightmare, he muttered, wiping a streak of paint from his face. Matthew smirked, wielding a paintbrush like a sword. But you love this nightmare. Jacob didn't answer. He just shook his head, but deep down, he knew the kid was right. Fatherhood wasn't a contract he could sign or a strategy he could plan, it was a wild, messy, wonderful adventure. And somehow, he was learning to love it, one chaotic day at a time. A late afternoon encounter. As the fading sunlight slipped behind towering skyscrapers, a rapid knocking at Jacob's office door pulled him away from the thick stack of reports before him. On the other side, Natalie's voice rang out, tense, unusually so, like an alarm shattering a quiet day. You'll want to take this in private, Jacob. His brow furrowed as an ominous feeling surged within him, an undercurrent of dread he couldn't quite place. He had no idea that in mere minutes, his carefully constructed walls were about to crumble. Natalie pushed the door open, stepping inside, followed by an unfamiliar woman, rigid in posture, as if she had just walked out of a courtroom. Her eyes were sharp as blades, her every movement exuding a forced composure. She stood firm, spine straight as a pillar, clearly having rehearsed this conversation hundreds of times in her head. At first, Jacob didn't recognize her. But the moment she spoke, her voice cutting through the air like a knife, "Hello, I'm Amelia, Olivia's sister," a silent blow struck him deep in the gut, leaving him frozen like stone. Olivia had never spoken much about her family, just passing mentions, enough for him to know that things weren't exactly warm between them. But now, standing before him, was Matthew's aunt, the enigmatic sister he had never met. And she wasn't here to mourn. "I want custody of Matthew," she declared, her voice ice-cold, slicing through the space between them. Jacob's grip tightened around the edge of his desk, his fingernails digging into the wood as though trying to anchor himself to a reality that was slipping from his grasp. "Excuse me," he ground out, his voice darkening. Amelia folded her arms, lips pressed together as if she had just played a decisive move in a high-stakes game. "You're not his biological father." A chill spread through Jacob's chest, as if a glacier had cracked open within him. "The DNA test says otherwise," he shot back, his voice unsteady with suppressed emotion. She exhaled sharply through her nose, as if she had anticipated his reaction. "You might be his father, Jacob, but you didn't even know he existed until a few weeks ago." Olivia raised him. "My family was there for him. And you?" You just showed up out of nowhere, acting like you can play dad as if it's that simple. She shook her head, her gaze piercing. That boy needs stability, not a clumsy billionaire who has no idea what he's doing. Jacob clenched his jaw, the anger rising within him like a firestorm. I know exactly what to do with him, he retorted, though deep down, he knew his words were just armor, a fragile defense against the fear clawing at him from within. Amelia smirked, lifting an eyebrow as if she were playing chess with an amateur. Do you? Because from what I hear, you're stumbling through this mess. Meanwhile, I've been there since the day he was born. If Olivia were alive, she wouldn't have left him with you. The words hit like a dagger, slicing through a wound Jacob hadn't dared to confront. He had no idea what Olivia would have wanted, she was gone, along with the answers he so desperately needed. But he knew Matthew. Matthew, the boy who had waltzed into his life like a ray of sunshine in the dead of winter, painting clumsy stick figures that somehow felt like home, turning his cold, sterile apartment into something real with his mischievous presence and open heart. And now, this woman, Amelia, thought she could just walk in and rip him away. Uproot him like a plant, as if he were nothing more than a possession to be claimed. No, Jacob said firmly, his voice as unyielding as forged steel. Amelia narrowed her eyes, her expression hardening. You don't get to just say, no, I know you work 70-hour weeks, she snapped, her words striking like a hammer against an anvil. You are not fit for this. Jacob met her glare, the fire inside him flaring to life. That's not your decision to make. Amelia sighed, pressing her lips together like someone forcing patience. Her voice softened, just slightly, as if she were trying to be reasonable. I don't doubt that you care about him, Jacob. But Matthew is family, my family. I have a lawyer, and we're going to make this official. You may be strong, but you can't fight against blood ties. Jacob's heart pounded like a war drum inside his chest. He had fought corporate giants, stared down ruthless businessmen who would sell their own partners for a profit. But this was a different battlefield, a place where contracts and money held no power, where the weapons were love, blood, and belonging. He looked at Amelia, saw the steely resolve in her eyes, and realized the deeper truth, she wasn't just here to take Matthew. She was here to strike at the deepest fear within him, that he wasn't enough. That Matthew needed something he could never provide. But then, he saw Matthew in his mind, his beaming smile, his tiny hands smudged with paint as they turned a plain wall into a battlefield of colors. The mischievous sparkle in his eyes as he live-streamed Jacob's groggy morning face to the entire company, laughing like it was the greatest victory of his life. Matthew didn't need a perfect life. He didn't need the ideal father from some textbook. He needed him. Jacob. With all his mistakes, his inexperience, his flaws. I don't care if you have lawyers, Jacob said, his voice low, steady as stone. Matthew stays with me. Amelia's frown deepened, but Jacob didn't let her speak. You think I don't know how to be a father? Maybe I don't. But I'm learning. Every day, every moment, for him. You might have blood ties, Amelia, but I have him, in the messy drawings he sticks on my fridge, in the laughter that fills my home, in every second I can't imagine living without him. For the first time, Amelia hesitated. A flicker of something, doubt, perhaps, passed through her icy composure. Jacob exhaled, his shoulders heavy but unshaken. He didn't know how this battle would unfold, courtrooms, legal fights, long and grueling days ahead. But he knew one thing. Matthew was his family. Not by paper. Not by blood. But by heart. And for the first time in his life, Jacob Elijah Hall, the man who believed he could control everything, was ready to abandon all strategy, all calculations, to fight for the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. When Matthew heard it all, standing silently in the hallway, half hidden beyond the doorway like a small ghost in the fading afternoon light, Jacob's heart sank, as if clenched by an invisible hand. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, and his young face bore an unreadable sorrow, like a rain-smeared painting. Amelia recognized him instantly, turning with an unexpectedly gentle voice, like a breeze slipping through a storm. "Matthew," she called, "I know this is hard, but I only want what's best for you." Matthew didn't respond. He just stood there, his clear eyes locked onto Jacob's. And for the first time since they had met, Jacob saw something flicker in that gaze, doubt, glimmering like a dying lantern in the darkness. Jacob stepped forward, each step heavy, as if carrying the weight of the world. "Matthew," he murmured, his voice barely louder than a whisper, afraid that words might shatter everything. "You don't have to pretend. If you don't want to stay with me, just say so." The words cut into him like a blade, twisting in his gut. Matthew bit his lip, nodding quickly as if trying to steady himself. "It's okay," he rasped, his voice fragile, like dry leaves falling. "I understand." Then, without another word, he turned and ran, vanishing down the hallway like a frightened fledgling seeking shelter. Jacob's heart pounded as he raced after him, calling out his name, his voice echoing against the cold walls. But Matthew was faster, darting into his room. And when Jacob reached the doorway, the sight before him made him freeze. The boy was hurriedly stuffing clothes into an old, worn backpack, tossing each item inside like fragments of a broken dream. "What are you doing?" Jacob asked, his voice thick, standing there as if lost. Matthew didn't look up. His small hands clutched the zipper, his thin shoulders trembling. "Packing," he said, trying to sound indifferent, though his voice wavered. "Just tell me where to go, and I'll go." Jacob swallowed hard, his throat dry as a desert. He, the man who had built an empire with an iron will, who had fortified his heart behind walls of reason, now stood helpless before the boy who had unraveled his perfect world with a mischievous smile and messy drawings. He knew there was only one thing to do. Slowly, he stepped forward, kneeling beside Matthew, searching for his eyes. "I want you here," he said, his voice rough, like wind through cracked stone. "With me." Matthew's breath hitched. His hands stilled. He looked up, uncertainty flickering in his eyes, like a lost fawn unsure whether to trust the light ahead. "But she said," he whispered. "I don't care what she said," Jacob cut in, placing a hand on Matthew's shoulder, firm but gentle, like the first embrace of spring. "You are my son, and I will keep you, no matter what." Matthew stared at him, his lips trembling, caught between belief and fear. "I mean it, kid," Jacob said, his voice soft as a lullaby. "I want you here, not because I have to, but because I want to." And then, like a wave breaking, Matthew let go of the backpack and threw himself into Jacob's arms. The force nearly knocked him over, but he steadied himself, wrapping his arms tightly around the boy, feeling his small frame tremble against him. Jacob closed his eyes, exhaling a long breath, holding them both together as if letting go would mean losing everything. For the first time, he knew, this was the most important fight of his life. And he would not lose. The battle for Matthew's custody didn't last as long as Jacob had expected. He had braced himself for a drawn-out legal war, for lawyers baring their teeth, for Amelia pulling every trick to take the boy from him. But in the end, the judge saw the truth. Jacob hadn't just thrown money or prestige into the fight, he had stood in that courtroom, steadfast as a mountain, proving he wasn't some distant figure trying to make up for lost time. He was Matthew's father, not just on paper, but in every moment he had spent learning to be one, from burnt pancake breakfasts and wobbly pillow forts to the way he held the boy close through storms of doubt. Amelia fought hard, but she couldn't deny the reality, she was a fleeting presence in Matthew's life. A few holiday visits couldn't compare to the months Jacob had given him, offering stability, love, and a real home. When the judge's gavel fell, granting Jacob full custody, he felt the weight on his chest lift, like a stone finally rolling away. He had won, not just legally, but in the only way that mattered, Matthew was his. The boy didn't even wait until they left the courthouse. He launched himself at Jacob, hugging him as tightly as he could, whispering into his shirt with a choked voice, "You're just like me." Jacob rolled his eyes but didn't let go, his lips quirking slightly. "Don't push it, kid." Matthew burst into laughter, the sound ringing out like music, melting away the last traces of tension. Things changed after that, not in some grand, earth-shattering way, but in quiet, meaningful moments. Jacob adjusted his schedule, cutting back on late-night meetings, working from home more often, making time for things he once dismissed as trivial. Afternoons spent painting with Matthew, though they usually ended with paint splattered on the walls. Movie nights, where the boys' non-stop commentary turned their living room into an impromptu comedy club. These weren't just habits anymore. They were everything. He liked how Matthew transformed the once sterile penthouse into a real home, with chaotic breakfasts, ridiculous debates over whether burgers were better than pancakes, and laughter filling every empty space. And despite his efforts to maintain an air of authority, Jacob couldn't stop Matthew from becoming the unofficial mascot of Patterson Enterprises. One day, the boys slipped into a meeting, proudly holding up a new drawing, Jacob in his suit, holding an oversized coffee cup, with Matthew beside him, beaming. The employees burst into laughter. Natalie smirked. "Boss, this kid's taking over the company soon." Jacob just shook his head, but his eyes gleamed with something warm and unspoken. He had learned to love this chaos. Day by day, moment by moment. And deep down, he knew, he would never go back to the cold, orderly emptiness of his past. Matthew wasn't just his son. He was the fire that lit up his world. And somehow, despite his clumsy, uncertain steps, Jacob had become the father the boy had always needed. Everything began at a lavish corporate gala, where expensive suits and forced investor smiles filled the space. Jacob had meticulously planned to keep Matthew on the fringes of the stage, letting the boy indulge in extravagant delicacies while steering clear of trouble, ensuring that Jacob himself could shine among the powerful crowd. But that plan, like every other seemingly perfect plan of Jacob's when Matthew was involved, burst like a soap bubble within 20 minutes. He was deep in conversation with a major investor, a glass of deep red wine in hand, when a familiar small voice echoed through the ballroom speakers, clear, proud, and utterly fearless. "Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew, and I have something important to say." Jacob turned, slow and deliberate, as if facing his inevitable fate, his eyes widening in silent horror. On the podium stood Matthew, his 10-year-old son, beaming like a Broadway star under the spotlight, his grin radiant amidst hundreds of stern, wealthy faces. "My dad," Matthew continued, undeterred by the suffocating silence, "is the greatest dad ever." Someone coughed. Another person stifled a laugh. Jacob closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose, muttering internally, "I will not survive this." But Matthew, ever oblivious, pressed on, his voice as confident as a tiny orator. "He used to be super boring, really. But now, he's actually pretty cool." Laughter rippled through the room like waves crashing on shore, sweeping away the last shreds of Jacob's professional reputation. He sighed, gripping his wine glass as if he might crush it. Matthew hopped off the stage, self-satisfied, and clapped Jacob on the back. "You can't argue with that." Jacob mumbled something about cutting allowances, but the damage was done, irreversible, irreparable. For weeks afterward, the moment remained the talk of the company. Executives teased him in boardrooms, employees whispered about it at the coffee machine, half mocking, half admiring the way their cold, aloof boss had been reduced to just a dad in front of the entire world. But truth be told, Jacob didn't mind. Matthew had become the center of his universe in ways he had never expected. He taught the boy how to tie a tie, a memorable disaster when Matthew nearly strangled himself with a bizarre knot, forcing Jacob to swoop in and save him amid their shared laughter. In return, Matthew insisted on teaching him how to be cool, wearing baseball caps backward and telling dad jokes. Neither lesson was a success. "You're hopeless," Matthew groaned one afternoon, flopping onto the couch, clutching his head like a despairing old man. Jacob flipped off the cap Matthew had forced him to wear for the 5th time, smirking. "You haven't even mastered tying a tie." Matthew scowled. "Not my fault, ties are evil." Jacob just laughed, ruffling the boy's hair despite the weak protests that followed. Then, one quiet afternoon, Jacob took Matthew somewhere special, a small cemetery on the outskirts of town, where lush green grass stretched endlessly, and the air was heavy with memories. Matthew was silent the entire drive, his usual energy dimmed, replaced by an unspoken solemnity as they stood before Olivia's gravestone. Jacob gave him space, watching as Matthew traced his small fingers over his mother's name. "She'd like you," Matthew said after a long silence, his voice soft but certain. "I mean, she liked you before, but now she'd like you more." Jacob swallowed the lump in his throat, feeling as if the weight of the world pressed against his chest. "Yeah." Matthew nodded, still staring at the stone. "You're not bad anymore." Jacob let out a quiet chuckle, the sound light as an autumn breeze. "That's some compliment, kid." Matthew smiled, a spark of mischief flickering in his eyes before he placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the grave, tiny blossoms trembling in the wind. Jacob stood beside him, feeling the weight of everything unspoken, the years lost, the memories he and Olivia would never reclaim. But when Matthew slipped his small hand into Jacob's, squeezing gently as if to say we still have each other, Jacob knew this moment was enough. The next day, Jacob had one last surprise. Matthew had no idea where they were going, bouncing in his seat, guessing wildly, from an amusement park to a space station, none of which were even close. When they arrived, his jaw dropped, his eyes wide with awe. In front of them stood a treehouse, not just any treehouse, but the one Olivia had dreamed of as a child, the one she had described to Jacob on long nights when they still believed the future was limitless. He had never forgotten. And now, he had made that dream real. "You built this?" Matthew asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Jacob smirked, hands in his pockets. "I paid for it to be built, but yeah." Matthew turned to him, unusually serious for a 10-year-old. "Still counts." Then he grinned, so bright, so full of life that Jacob's heart ached in the warmest way possible. "It's perfect," Matthew said, his voice as clear as wind chimes. "Like a real family." Something inside Jacob shifted, deep, subtle, unshakable. He reached out, ruffling Matthew's hair, ignoring the boy's giggling protests. "That's because we are one," he said, his voice softer than usual, like a whisper between two souls. Before he could react, Matthew bolted up the ladder like a squirrel, glancing back with a teasing grin. "Hurry up, Dad." Jacob stood below, looking up at the boy, his light, his little storm who had turned his life upside down, and laughed. He climbed after him, slow but steady, each step a quiet affirmation of belonging. The treehouse trembled under their weight, but it stood firm, just like the bond they had built. From above, Matthew pointed out toward the distant city, spinning ridiculous stories about their kingdom, and Jacob listened, letting the boy's laughter fill the empty spaces in his heart he hadn't even realized were there. Somewhere, Olivia was smiling. And for the first time, Jacob knew she would truly be happy, not just for him, but for them. For this small, imperfect, yet perfect family. For the first time in years, Jacob let himself drift along the current of life, free of calculations and control. He followed Matthew, the boy's clear laughter echoing through the trees, a symphony of joy Jacob never realized he had longed for. That small treehouse, built from Olivia's childhood dreams, was now where Jacob sat, his back resting against a sturdy wooden beam, legs stretched out on the floor like an old man savoring a peaceful afternoon. Matthew, with bright eyes and animated hands like a tiny conductor, excitedly outlined plans for their upcoming adventures. He spoke of a secret password, just between us, Dad. Of club rules, and most notably, the no boring business talk law. Jacob raised an eyebrow, chuckling as he recognized himself as the target of that rule, but he didn't protest. He simply watched the boy's glowing face, his hands waving with boundless energy. Moments like these, simple yet warm, made him realize just how much his life had changed in mere months. Jacob used to live for work, a machine measuring his worth by profits, contracts, and strategic victories. He had built walls so high, so impenetrable, that even he couldn't see the light beyond them. And yet, a 10-year-old boy, with a crumpled photograph in hand and an innocent question, "Are you my dad?" had walked into his office and shattered everything he once believed was unchangeable. Back then, he didn't know the answer. He didn't know if he could be a father, or if he even deserved to be one. But now, sitting in the treehouse, listening to Matthew chatter about hidden snack stashes and plans to conquer the kingdom above, he understood. He was a father, not just because of a DNA test or shared blood, but because every day, he chose to keep the boy close. Because of the laughter he had relearned. Because he now placed Matthew above everything that had once defined his world. Jacob once believed happiness had been lost forever when Olivia left, taking with her a part of his soul that nothing could replace. His life had become an endless cycle of meetings, mergers, and a futile chase for something he couldn't even name. But now, he knew, happiness hadn't disappeared, it had merely hidden, waiting for him to find it again. And Matthew was the wind that had swept away the dust, the fire that had warmed an apartment that once felt more like a museum than a home. Suddenly, the boy flopped down beside him, stretching out on the wooden floor like a lazy cat after a long day, sighing in contentment. "I've decided," Matthew declared, his tone regal, as if issuing a royal decree. Jacob raised an eyebrow, feigning wariness. "That sounds dangerous." Matthew ignored him, eyes sparkling. "This is the best treehouse in the world." Jacob smirked, replying with a hint of teasing, "Hope so, because it cost a fair bit." Matthew turned, frowning like a tiny old man misunderstood. "You know that's not why, right?" Jacob blinked, caught off guard by the boy's seriousness. "Oh." Matthew hesitated, fiddling with a loose thread on his sleeve as if searching for the right words, then shrugged. "It's the best because it's ours." That simple statement struck Jacob like a tiny arrow to the heart, tightening his chest. He said nothing, only reached out to ruffle Matthew's hair, ignoring the boy's half-hearted grumble, "You're such an idiot." Jacob murmured, "Yeah, I guess I am." Matthew grinned, his laughter ringing like wind chimes. "But I learned from the best." Jacob chuckled, shaking his head in mock exasperation. "I was never an idiot before you showed up, kid." Matthew smirked, triumphant. "Exactly." The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and pink, while the cool evening breeze whispered through the leaves. Below, the world carried on, distant and unimportant. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Jacob felt at peace, like a traveler who had finally found safe harbor after a storm. Matthew yawned, stretching his arms toward the sky as if trying to embrace the entire world, then leaned against Jacob's shoulder, as naturally as if he had belonged there from the very beginning. Jacob hesitated for only a second before wrapping an arm around him, pulling him closer, the small warmth of the boy like a flame against his side. For years, he had believed that real love, the kind that transforms a person, had slipped through his fingers when Olivia left, leaving him with a past he could never reclaim. But now, in this treehouse, with the son he had built everything for, he understood, love had never been lost, it had only been waiting, patiently, until he was ready to find it again. Matthew sighed, his voice sleepy, muffled against Jacob's shirt. "You said we're a real family." Jacob looked down at him, his heart full of something so deep he had once thought himself incapable of feeling. "Yeah," he whispered, pressing a rare kiss onto Matthew's tousled hair, "we are." The boy's laughter echoed through the trees, blending with the fading twilight, and Jacob knew, this was only the beginning. A chaotic, wonderful journey. And it was exactly where he was meant to be. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the window, Matthew woke up with a bright grin. "We need more rules for the Treehouse Club," he declared over breakfast, waving a syrup-covered fork. Jacob took a sip of coffee, feigning seriousness. More rules. You sure, kid? Matthew nodded enthusiastically. We need a rule about no falling asleep in the middle of adventure stories. You totally dozed off last night. Jacob laughed, nearly choking on his coffee. I'm old, kid, I can't keep up with you. Matthew smirked, eyes gleaming mischievously. Old but still cool, at least for now. As the days passed, the treehouse became their fortress, a place where Matthew spun wild tales of King Matthew and Knight Jacob, and Jacob sat, listening with a smile he could no longer hide. He had once thought his life was nothing but dry numbers and cold victories. But now, it was laughter, the scent of fresh wood, and a small hand gripping his. Matthew had taught him that family wasn't just about blood, it was about moments like these, messy, chaotic, and beautiful. And as the boy scrambled up the ladder again, calling out, "Hurry up, Dad!" Jacob knew he wouldn't trade this place, this family, for anything in the world.